Determine the left-sided limit and the right-sided limit and the two-sided limit as x approaches pi over 2 of cosine of x divided by 1 plus cosine of 2x. Each of these involves the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of cosine of x divided by 1 plus cosine of 2x. First thing to do is try plugging a pi over 2 in for each of the x's. That will give cosine of pi over 2 divided by 1 plus cosine of 2 pi over 2. The cosine of pi over 2 is a 0 divided by 1 plus the cosine 2 pi over 2. The 2's can cancel, leaving just pi. This gives 0 over 1 plus cosine of pi, which is a negative 1. And 1 minus 1 is a 0, giving the 0 over 0 indeterminate form. We will need to rework this. One option, since we have a cosine of 2x, it's in the denominator here, we can make use of one of the three identities that cosine of 2x is equal to. The first one is cosine squared x minus sine squared x. The second one is 2 cosine squared x minus 1. The third one is 1 minus 2 sine squared x. Since the numerator here is a cosine of x, it's probably best to make use of the second one, 2 cosine squared x minus 1. This will be limit as x approaches pi over 2 of cosine of x divided by 1 plus, and replacing cosine of 2x with 2 cosine squared x minus 1. We'll give cosine of x over 1 plus, we can distribute this plus into here, so it'll be plus 2 cosine squared x, and then plus times a minus is a minus 1. The 1's can cancel if we put them together because of a 1 and a negative 1, and this will then become limit as x approaches pi over 2 of cosine of x over 2 cosine squared of x. One of the cosines in the denominator can cancel with the cosine in the numerator, leaving a 1 in the numerator. So this has now become 1 over 2 cosine of x. Now that we have canceled the cosine of x from the numerator and denominator, we should no longer have the 0 over 0 indeterminate form. And we can retry plugging the pi over 2 in for the remaining x's. That will give 1 over 2 cosine of pi over 2, which is 1 over 2 times the cosine of pi over 2 is a 0, and 2 times 0 is 0. The 0 in the denominator is not actually a 0, since x is approaching pi over 2, it does not reach pi over 2. But a limit result of a non-zero number divided by 0 is equal to either positive infinity or negative infinity, where the sign of the infinity often depends on the side the limit is approaching from. Therefore, we'll have to work out each of the one-sided limits separately. We have the left-sided limit indicated by the negative superscript on the pi over 2. Of cosine of x divided by 1 plus cosine of 2x, the original. And we have the right-sided limit indicated by a positive superscript on the pi over 2 of cosine of x divided by 1 plus cosine of 2x, the original. Let's start with the left-sided limit. Right now it will be the 0 over 0 indeterminate form, so it will be put through the same identity for the cosine of 2x. Giving cosine of x over 1 plus 2 cosine squared x minus 1, which will give the limit as x approaches pi over 2 from the left side of cosine of x over, the ones will cancel, and it'll be just 2 cosine squared of x. One of the cosines in the denominator can cancel with 1 in the numerator, leaving a 1 in the numerator. And this is now going to be 1 over 2 cosine of x. There is a 0 in the denominator happening because x is approaching pi over 2 and the cosine of pi over 2 is a 0. But it's only approaching 0. It doesn't actually reach 0. We're approaching pi over 2 from the left side here. The left side of pi over 2 is less than pi over 2, but close to pi over 2. On the unit circle, less than pi over 2, but close to it, we'll put it in the first quadrant. In the first quadrant of the unit circle, the cosine is positive. Therefore, this cosine will be positive, but it's approaching to a pi over 2, and the cosine of pi over 2 is approaching to a 0. So we can replace the cosine of x with a positive 0. We can then plug pi over 2 in for any remaining x's. There are no remaining x's, so it'll just be 1 over 2 times a positive 0. 2 times a positive 0 is a positive 0. The numerator is a positive 1. Positive over positive is positive. Non-zero over 0 is infinity, and there's the result of the left-sided limit. The right-sided limit can work out in a similar fashion. Start with the identity for cosine of 2x in the denominator. Again, the ones can cancel, leaving just a 2 cosine squared x. And one of the cosines in the denominator can cancel with the 1 in the numerator, leaving a 1 in the numerator. And so it becomes 1 over 2 cosine of x. The difference is the right side of pi over 2, and the right side of pi over 2 means greater than pi over 2, but it's approaching it. So near pi over 2 but greater than pi over 2 puts it in the second quadrant on the unit circle. In the second quadrant of the unit circle, cosine is a negative. But as it approaches to pi over 2, cosine of pi over 2 is a 0. So it's approaching to a value of 0, but it's remaining negative the entire time. So now cosine can be replaced with a negative 0. The pi over 2 can plug in for any of the remaining x's. There is no other x's, so it'll just become a 1 over 2 times a negative 0, which gives 1 over 2 times negative 0 is a negative 0. The numerator is a positive 1. Positive over negative is a negative. Non-zero over 0 is an infinity. And there is the result of the right-sided limit. The two-sided limit depends on the results of the one-sided limits. Here they do not match. So the two-sided limit up here will be does not exist. And there's the results of the three different limits.